Watch for Me on the Mountain by Forrest Carter. Chapter 2. Westward a low horizon swallowed the sun, belching red skyward and turning the desert purple. Fires flared before the wickiups. Geronimo picked up the heavy iron and worked at the clasp lock on the leg irons. Naish had brought him the iron and a water bag. He had refused the maize cake, knowing it was a full day's ration for Naish. He had observed Naish's appearance. Though he was young, his muscles were stringy, standing bare in flabby flesh. Naish was being consumed by starvation. He is giving his rations to his wife and baby, Geronimo thought. He paused to look at his own body, naked where he had stripped away the filthy clothing and washed. Despite his time in the hole, he was hard. The months in the Sierra Madre had given this to him: venison and yucca meal, shuttock berries, mezcal, and Mexican beef, clean water. He grunted, twisting the iron, and the clasp lock sprang loose. He was free. The footsteps were light. He heard them and sat without moving. She was small, even for an Apache. A calico skirt ballooned around her in the wind. Her hair was pulled back severely from an oval face, knotted and tied behind her head. She knelt without speaking and placed a long knife by Geronimo's hand and set boot moccasins by his side. Over them she laid a long breechclout, and silently she began ministering to his deep-cut ankles. Using powdered root of ocotillo on the wounds, she bound them with cloth. "Thank you," Geronimo said politely. She was tying the cloth and didn't look up. "I am Salah, she said, and finishing with the bandages, moved to lay wood for a fire before the wickiup. The twilight deepened as she worked, and Geronimo watched her impassively, but with suspicion. The bluecoats had many spies among the Apaches, those who would ferret out information in return for extra rations for their families. Raising from her work, she whistled, and a small boy ran out of the dark carrying a glowing stick that she placed within the wood. A flame flickered, and the boy stepped back shyly behind her into the darkness. "You have family?" Geronimo asked. He slipped the long knife from its sheath and slowly honed it on the leather, slapping and sliding the blade. "I have my son, Sansa," she said, hesitating, watching the blade moving up and down the sheath. "My husband was killed by the Tucson White-Eye raiders where we farmed. My baby girl died here." He did not look at her, but pausing from his blade sharpening, he carefully selected a hair from his head, jerking the hair loose. He held it dangling in the air before him and swept the knife in a vicious, quick swing. The blade did not cut the dangling hair. He resumed the monotonous honing. Zala spoke loudly now, as if to call his attention away from the slapping blade. "My son is almost 9 years. He is almost a warrior. Once," she said as though delivering a prepared speech, "he defied the soldiers. When my baby was dying, he ran beyond the boundaries and dug mezcal and brought it back, hiding from the soldiers all day as he came. Trying to save my baby. The soldiers would have killed him. He is very brave." She reached hastily behind her and pulled the boy forward to stand with her. The fire played on spindly legs and arms. A small stomach punched beneath the rib cage over his breechcloth, bloating. The boy studied his feet, staring at them as though he had not seen them before. Geronimo gave no indication he had observed the boy. The knife slapped back and forth on the leather. The fire crackled higher. Her voice was hollow now, brave and prepared like a schoolgirl's. I know how to fire a gun. I am strong and can fight like a warrior. Her voice trailed away. Geronimo stopped the knife and looked at her across the fire. The boy is no warrior, he said flatly. Sansa shuffled back away from the hard eyes and secreted himself behind his mother, but Zala did not retreat. Instead, her eyes met Geronimo's boldly. She patted her hair into place, smoothed her face with her hands, and where her nervous fingers found a torn place in her skirt, she folded it away from notice. I am still young, she said. You have no one. I will do as you want. She tried to smile coyly, but her chin trembled. Geronimo stared at her. I will not marry you, he said harshly. Zala bowed her head, and in a moment the whispered words of Apache disgrace came across the fire. I will not ask you to marry me. Geronimo held the knife suspended in the air, watching. Slowly she raised her head, and her face was wet. I know you are going, she said weakly. I know. All say that you have surrendered only to come and take others away. I must go. I must have my son. I want him to live. He can live here, Geronimo sneered. He will be fed enough to live. No, Zala whispered. I want him to live where he is not told where he must walk and what he must do, where there is no power over him. You want him to be free? Geronimo asked, and for the first time his voice carried a hint of reason. Yes, she answered, to be free in the mountains. Geronimo resumed the slapping of the knife blade. You may go, he said casually. Sansa the boy peered from behind his mother and looked at the hard face lighting and shadowing in the firelight, the terrible legend of blood and death who casually ordained their freedom while he sharpened a knife. Zala moved toward Geronimo, but he held up the knife, halting her. No, you owe me nothing, and so I will accept nothing. You will pay enough for freedom. Maybe you will die. He paused and looked hard at her. There is something you may do. Yes, Zala asked. You may go to every Wickiup this night and tell them Geronimo knows that they know. Tell them Geronimo has already placed warriors in the bush, and any man, woman, or child who walks toward the fort will be killed. I will, Zala said. Carefully he selected a hair from his head, holding it dangling in the air. The knife swept snake-like, sparkling in the firelight. This time a short piece of hair was left hanging. Geronimo grunted. He rose and walked away into the darkness. Shyly, Zala called after him. When will we go? I do not know, came floating back to her. Geronimo was gone. He found Naish outside his own Wickiup, sitting, waiting. Squatting beside him, he asked, Are there some you can trust? A few, Naish answered dryly. Then send them into the brush with bows and arrows. No one must take the word to Fort Thomas. Naish slipped away, and through the night Geronimo visited the Wickiups. Dang it, I ain't turned the page. There we go. He squatted by the dying embers of Cheto's fire and said nothing. Cheto knew why he was there, and after a long time spoke. No, he said. Geronimo rose, looking into the glow of embers, not at Cheto. We are going south into the Sierra Madre. Do you wish to live in this way? No, Cheto said. I do not wish to live in this way, but I am not a fool. Now, there is no other way. And he stared stonily before him as Geronimo walked into the shadows. Loco poked at his fire. Geronimo had not spoken. He had appeared and squatted across from him. Loco spoke into the fire. The old way of freedom is gone, Geronimo. It is hopeless. Excuse me. And as Geronimo rose, Loco stood still. He said wistfully, it would be good to see the mountains again, to be free. For a little while, then suddenly, I will go. And so through the night, Geronimo appeared at Wickiups. He listened and spoke little. He did not answer the questions. How can you hope to outrun the soldiers' horses so far to the Sierra Madre? The Sierra Madre is far away. How can you survive to reach her? But by morning, excited talk ran through the Wickiups of those who were going. They talked of plants still bearing fruit in the mountains, the yucca. There would be piñon nuts in cool groves. The berries would be gone, but they would make flour from the palo verde seeds and chinook acorns, rich flour full of life. Some recited places they knew where cold water ran from rocks and shaded canyons. They began to pack meager rations of meal and to fix soches, the slings to carry babies, so they might run faster. Men were fashioning crude short bows from cholla sticks, twisting the fiber of guilla to string them. Using reeds, they split the ends and precariously secured pointed stones for arrows. Dawn came, and glaring and hot over the eastern rim of the desert. The rumors were spreading. Old stories of Geronimo were recounted. He was untrustworthy. His trail of war was littered with the dead of his own people. He was often drunk on Tizwin. Naish sought him out and found him in the creek bed. He was studying the tips of bare cottonwood branches. Naish knew he was looking for omens. Perhaps even Geronimo needed reassurance. For a while, Naish followed him, pulling down the branches Geronimo had been holding. At their tips, there were the scars of fallen leaves. On each scar was a face. Some of the faces were smiling, some were frowning. Some were fierce. Others looked weird and monstrous. Geronimo sat down on the creek bank, holding his head. Tomorrow, Naish said quietly, is counting day. Yes, Geronimo acknowledged. He would say nothing more, but rose and walked away, crossing the creek bed and disappearing in the brush. By midday, wind was beginning to blow. After a monotonous moan, it lifted, whimpering in bursts. In early afternoon, sand clouds appeared in the north, rising 1,000 feet into the sky. By mid-afternoon, the wind was screaming. The sun dimmed yellow and changed to a pale green lemon, easily watched with the eye, and the horizon and the sky were gone. Geronimo appeared before the Wickiup of Naish. Tell them to gather here at darkness. We will leave. He disappeared in the whirling sand. Naish would always remember that day. How the air had grown sullen and heavy in the morning, how the tongue tasted of metal, how in the beginning bushes had moved without wind. They gathered in dark's half-light and came close to one another, peering through sand to recognize a friend. Many who had said they would go did not come. Sand, driven in rasping bursts by the wind, struck the sides of the Wickiups and kept them inside. Geronimo moved among those who had gathered, separating women from men. He lined the women in a long column of twos, the young woman by the side of the old, the woman without a baby beside the woman who carried a baby in her breast sling. The women had covered their faces with cloth and placed wet cloths over the heads of their babies. Behind the women, in the same column of twos, he placed the children. The older by the younger, the boy by the girl. After the children, he spread the warriors in a column, 3 abreast, slightly wider than the women and children's. The warriors must pick up the child who fell, help the baby-laden woman who faltered, seize and carry with them the old woman who lagged behind. A Apache fashion, they carried nothing except the barest necessities for survival. Small food sacks and water bags, knives, and the warriors, their crude bows and arrows. Twilight deepened. Those who could watch from their wickiups barely saw the figures now, a long line bending their backs against the wind and sand from the north, the children standing uncertainly between the women and warriors and seeking assurance, holding one another's hands. Geronimo was bitterly disappointed. 18 warriors, 53 women and children. Most of the women were widows, desperate to save their seed, babies, children, bits and pieces of families destroyed by soldiers. They stood like sheep, dumb and apologetic that they endangered all the lives with their cumbersome flocks. He began at the head of the column, grasping Zala and the woman behind her by the shoulders. He shouted in their faces, "We will live at the mountains. Say it." His face was fierce, his eyes hypnotic. The women shouted back, "We will live in the we will live in the mountains." Down the column he moved. An old woman standing silently in the column was seized by the shoulders, seized by the throat and slapped brutally again and again as Geronimo shouted at her. Several warriors moved toward him but backed away as the old woman began to shout. He shoved his face close to the children's, and when they mumbled, he shook them and made them shout at the top of their lungs. By the time he reached the warriors, the entire column was chanting and screaming, "We will live at the mountains." Standing before the warriors, he pumped his arm like a choirmaster, leaping and jumping, churning the air with his arms. Imperceptibly, the screaming changed tone. The forced desperation gave way to rhythmic harmony, and in the harmony there rose a note of exuberance. There in the whipping sand and the roaring wind, an exulting spirit, as if an anthem, invaded the minds of the group that only shortly before had been seized with doubt and fear and cringing before the storm. Warriors, feeling the exuberance, began to dance in the grip of the power. Children stomped their feet in unison, and cloths fell from the faces of the women. They no longer felt the sand. Abruptly, Geronimo whirled, trotted to the head of the column, and waving his arm, led them in a quick, shuffling gait toward the southwest. Naish, at the head of the warriors, noted the direction Geronimo led. It was almost directly toward Fort Thomas, and the soldiers only dimly did the thought flicker in his mind to protest. He was too caught up in the chant, the blind faith in the something Geronimo had created. The Dragoon Mountains lay behind Fort Thomas, and the Dragoons ran south toward the Sierra Madre. Any other course would have been a loop around the fort, costing time. They could not afford an effort they could not survive. Geronimo knew the sandstorm would hide them from the soldiers, and no one questioned the fate that the sandstorm would last to carry them past the fort. As they ran, the chant ceased. Breath was needed for running, but Naish remembered the sensation. The words rang over and over in his mind. "We will live at the mountains. Live mountains." The two words boomed in the conscious mind. Later, no one remembered that night run across the plains. They remembered beginning, the short times they were allowed to rest, with Geronimo moving among them, chanting, "We will live in the mountains." They remembered the ending. With the chant, the shaman Geronimo had placed their conscious minds at the mountains where there was life. Their prize, their conscious minds which would have picked and worried over the stumbling step, the distance, the soldiers, the storms, all were suspended. The fumbling, failing human body is controlled by the conscious mind, and having forced them to set it aside, Geronimo induced them to allow their spirit mind to control them. And so they became of the spirit and performed the unexplainable supernatural effort. Geronimo had suspended the material space between them and the mountains. He had suspended the time to reach them. There was no space, there was no time. The illusions of the conscious mind. United States Army officers would later record that the remaining Apaches at San Carlos lied, that it was impossible for humans to have left at the time given by the Apaches and reached the Dragoons when they did. But the Army officers were using a scale of measurement that was material. They lived and worked and fought in time and space and did not know the world of Geronimo. When they forded the Gila River, they could have easily seen Fort Thomas or been seen had the sandstorm not covered them. Between the river's banks, it was calm, with wind whipping overhead, dust dropping, choking. Briefly, they rested. The women wet cloths from the streams and wiped the faces of children and babies. Geronimo, turning slightly south, led them over the farther bank and back into the storm. The wind was squarely at their backs now, pushing them away from Fort Thomas. No one knew when the wind died. They became aware that it had, leaving a smothering dust cloud. Geronimo, turning slightly south, led them over the farther bank and back into the storm. The wind was squarely at their backs now, pushing them away from Fort Thomas. No one knew when the wind died. They became aware that it had, leaving a smothering dust cloud through which they ran. Suddenly, they ran out of the cloud, gasping clean air and seeing stars and millions of light dots above them. After a time, the lights dimmed and pink shafts shot skyward from the east. They saw the mountains. The Dragoons were rocked against the sky. Geronimo increased their speed. The sun was well into the cloudless sky when they reached the canyon. They rested, touching one another, shocked as if just awakening to this thing they had done together. The warriors brought an old woman to the canyon shade. They had been supporting her running. The women shared meal cakes and passed the water bags among them. Geronimo stood apart, looking back toward Fort Thomas. Naish walked to him, and they studied the horizon through Naish's Spanish binoculars. "Now they know," Geronimo grunted. "From where the wind died, they will follow our tracks." The canyon sliced into the side of the mountain, narrow and sand-floored, perpendicular, smooth, rock sides 300 feet above them. Along the floor, Geronimo ran, turning to wave them on. They felt weariness now, and each time he stopped, were quick to sit, resting against the scant shade of the eastern wall. At noon, the canyon turned west. There was no shade. The air was thick and suffocating. Babies cried, and sweat stuck to the women's dresses to their bodies. Geronimo stopped. Motioning to Naish, he began to search out handholds. Carefully climbing the canyon wall 50 feet above the canyon floor, he found the small opening and reached inside. He pulled out rifles and cartridge belts, tossing them down to Naish. 20 rifles. Most of the warriors knew only the black powder musket. Geronimo dropped to the canyon floor and showed them how to work the rifles. These were breech loaders. The United States Army issued Spencer rifles. The eyes of the warriors gloated over the quickness of loading. They sighted along the barrels, ran their hands over the smooth stocks. These were the guns of the bluecoats. An old warrior felt the power of the gun. He raised his rifle, waving it high over his head, and screamed the Apache war cry, echoing down the canyon. All the warriors joined in, echoing a confusion of screams and chants, except Geronimo. He stood head down until, seeing him standing silently, they became quieted. The last sound died. The silence was heavy on the air. Geronimo looked down the canyon the way they'd come. "Brothers," his voice echoed, "the horses and soldiers are moving toward us." He spoke slowly so that echoes would not confuse what he said. "These mountains are no wider than a snake lying in the desert. These mountains end to the south, and where they end, there's a full day's running across the desert before we reach the Madre. This canyon," he pointed ahead down the narrow sand floor, "runs west. In a little while there is a place we must leave it and go south. The soldiers will come down this canyon. When they see our tracks turn south into the mountains, they will ride back to the plains, back to the canyon mouth. They will ride fast south beside the mountains. They will be waiting at the end and kill us on the desert. We must run to reach the Sierra Madre." He paused and paced before them, head down. A gloom spread over the band. Women held their babies tighter and children came close to their mothers. The warriors stared at their feet, fingering the rifles and feeling foolish for their outburst a moment before. Geronimo stopped and stretched out his arms as if to touch the canyon walls. "Here," he said, "the walls can be climbed. There must be a warrior who climbs to the top of each wall. When the soldiers come, only one warrior fires his gun. He fires it many times from the top of the wall. The soldiers will stop. They must send men back to the canyon mouth, send them along the top of the wall." He swept his arm in a wide arc. "When the soldiers reach this warrior, he must fight them until he is gone. The soldiers will go back and come again down the canyon. This time Geronimo pointed to the opposite canyon wall. The second warrior will fire many times and stop them. They must go back again to the canyon mouth and come along the top of this warrior's wall. He must fight them until he is gone. The soldiers must be made to wait here a long time before they find our tracks turning south. Brothers," he stopped, turning his face to the sky as though praying, before he looked at them again. "Brothers, there must be 2 among you who have no wife, no children." Silence. A breeze whispering through the canyon moved the bushy hair of the warriors beneath their headbands. A baby cried and was hushed by its mother. There was a rustle among the men as a slender brave rose in their middle. He held his rifle before him across his chest. "My wife and children were killed by the soldiers," he said. "I am called Boto. I will stay." No one spoke. An old warrior stood, his buckskin warband held in place bushy white hair that framed a wrinkled face. "I am called Tina." His voice was thin with an old quavering that broke. "My wife is old. If she could be..." "She will be cared for," Geronimo said. The old man walked toward him. He limped, slapping his crooked leg. He laughed. "See, now I will not have to run like the rest of you. I will rest on the canyon wall." He laughed hollowly, feeling foolish that no one joined in the mirth of his joke. Geronimo embraced him, and they stood for a moment, arms about each other. Boto followed him, and he too was embraced by Geronimo. No one talked. There was nothing to say. Geronimo walked a little way down the canyon to the west. He waved his arm forward and turned away in the shuffling trot. The women tiredly followed behind him, followed by the children and the warriors. As they ran, an old woman stepped from the line and stood waiting for them to pass. Her white hair was long, almost to the waist of her dress, faded and torn, covering a tiny frame. She began walking slowly back. As the Apaches shuffled toward the west, they heard the chant rising and echoing in the canyon. "Only the mountains live forever, only the rocks live forever," the death chant. Geronimo looked back. Boto and Tina were standing in the middle of the canyon singing. The old woman was holding Tina's hand. End of chapter.